Okay, welcome everybody to the final in our current series of Jenny Cheshire lectures. I'm very happy to introduce Paul Kerswill today. Before I do that, I just wanted to say a few words about the series in general. Paul is the final speaker in our initial slate of 5 annual lectures in this series. The Linguistics department established this in 2011 in honor of Jenny Cheshire's retirement, or I feel like I should say retirement, because as many of you have noticed, she's not behaving entirely retired. She's currently editor of Language and Society, and I'm holding this up just to draw your attention to the fact that you have free access to an issue on the back if you want to take one of these along with you. I didn't notice it until Jenny pointed it out, so passing that along. So, as I said, she's currently editor and she's producing new research as prolifically as ever. We're very grateful to the college and to the school for their really generous and continuing support for this series. And I'd especially like to thank Zoe and Annette for organizing today's event. Although this is the last in the original series, we're very keen to continue the series in some form. We've really enjoyed the great attendance by students and colleagues and friends from around London, from beyond London. And so this is just to say, watch this space. It's not the end, it's just the end of the beginning, and we do plan to continue these events. It's a real pleasure to introduce Paul. His name came to mind immediately 5 years ago when we were thinking of possible speakers for this series. As many of you know, Paul and Jenny have had several major grants together, going back at least 16 years, based on my little explorations, maybe longer. And the body of work that's come out of that collaboration has really been one of the foremost contributions to sociolinguistics in recent decades. I thought I'd mention just a few major research areas that Paul's work has either established or has substantially developed, mainly in work on dialects of English and dialects of Norwegian. You're a native speaker of Norwegian and write articles in Norwegian, by the way. This isn't an exhaustive list, but areas such as dialect leveling and change, geographical diffusion, especially the urban-rural relationship, koineisation and new dialect formation, the role of children and adolescents in language change, the structure of speech communities, dialect perception, salience in language change, migration, social mobility, social class, ethnicity, and social networks. And I don't really mean that he's just worked in these areas, he's established a lot of what we know about these things. So it's really an extraordinary range of contributions to the field. Throughout all of this work, Paul has also pioneered new methodologies, and he's also helped establish the research community that we're all a part of today. So just to give 2 examples, I think it was in connection with the first grant with Jenny in the early 90s. Paul played a major part in establishing both UKLVC and iClave, both of which I think people would agree are the 2 leading venues for variation work in the UK and in Europe today. And a final thing I wanted to mention that I really admire about Paul is that he takes on the media. He really engages really well with the media, so he's played a huge part in improving public understandings of the work that all of us do, and maybe even more importantly, understandings among journalists and broadcasters, and he continues to do that as well. So I feel I'd better stop talking and start listening and learn something. Paul's talk today has a very long title, so you must have read it by now. I won't repeat it. Paul Kerswill.
Thank you, Deviani. Yes. Right, thank you very much. This lecture is going to be something of a tour through time and, to some extent, space. And I hope it contributes in various ways, in the ways Deviani was talking about. I think perhaps one of the reasons why she was saying some of those nice things about me is that I'm of a particular age that actually places me in between some people who are now retired and people who are still up and coming. So there was, some years ago, I looked at the ages of people who have posts in sociolinguistics, and I found that I was something like 12 years younger than some and 12 years older than some other people, and I was on my own in that particular section. So that's one reason why maybe something happened during those years. But that's what we're talking about now. So there's a long title here, which you've already read, and this is somewhat speculative, a lot of this, and we have a demographer in the room who will hopefully leave his or her criticisms until afterwards. Not attack me, anyway. So, okay, so what I want to do is to try to account for dialect formation and dialect change through the last 200 years or so. Great Britain during the rise of the Industrial Revolution, it seems to be a convenient place to start, because there were major social upheavals then, and they set the pattern really for modern urban Britain. So that's one reason really for choosing that time. One thing I'm going to be concerned with, I suppose, peripherally, implicitly perhaps, is Lebov's idea of using the present to explain the past. So, are there things that we can look at nowadays which maybe could explain what happened in the past, the last 200 years or so? So this assumes a set of social processes which are universally applicable as causes of dialect change, and these processes happen in different proportions in different places and times. One such process, the only one I'm really going to be talking about, I suppose, is the idea of face-to-face communication leading to dialect contact. Okay, so this is something familiar to most people, and that in fact is our starting point. So, for the dialect contact, familiar territory probably for many people here, outcomes are determined, I would say, at least partly determined, at least by the linguistic features which exist in the feature pool. This is actually a term, I think, introduced by Sally Coco Mufwene some years ago. Feature pool of linguistic items, phonology, morphology, and so on, that exist in a given area, in a given community of speakers. So one of the determining factors here is what is the relative difficulty in terms of learning of that feature, and also complexity is something also partly to do with learning here. So who is in contact with who, or possibly whom? I sat on the train today debating what to put here, and I left it like this. This is not, I would normally say whom actually, but Peter Trudgill, one of my eminent predecessors in this series, he likes to say with who, because that annoys some people. But who is in contact with children, adolescents, adults, and in what social settings? Okay, so this is one of the things that's going to recur today. And this is the deterministic model that Peter Trudgill put forward when he was trying to account for New Zealand English some 10 or 12 years ago. So this is one of my starting points. Mobility and contact. Okay, this is one of the demographic features that I want to talk about. So it's at least one of the keys to understanding dialect formation and dialect change. And mobility, and I'm drawing on the work really of Dave Britton here, is both long and short term, and some of it's pretty obvious, I suppose. So it's relocation from rural to urban, from urban to rural in more recent years. It's commuting, and it's been pointed out this is mainly a middle-class pursuit, that middle-class people might commute on average 15, 20 miles or something, and people in non-middle-class jobs commute maybe a mile or something like that on average, a big difference anyway. So that's an interesting thing, when you're thinking about dialect change. This group of people move around a lot, and this other group of people hardly move around at all. People visit. They visit relatives and friends. And one idea that I have, and I don't know whether it's borne out at all, and that is that people who are immigrants, or the descendants of immigrants, have family members elsewhere in the country, and they visit them, all right? Whereas people who are not immigrants or descendants of immigrants tend not to have such far-flung social networks. That's something I'd like to know a bit more about. In the 20th century, there were 2 world wars, and that meant men coming together in the forces, and women going to work in a way that they didn't before or afterwards, for that matter. And then when moving back in time a little bit now, in the second half of the 19th century, we had railways, we had the suburbanisation of cities, especially London, Manchester, Birmingham. And then in the first half of the 19th century, we had the formation of new industrial urban areas, which were partly established through migration, and that's one of the things I want to talk about. Demographic change, what kind of changes can we expect? Well, here's some figures, and I'm not sure how reliable these are, but apparently back in 1831, 34% of the population lived in cities, and 20 years later, 50%, then 80 years after that, 80%, and then another 60 years after that, 90% of the population lived in cities. So it's gradual urbanisation. But I think it's levelled off at that point because of counter-urbanisation, for instance, particularly that. So we're dealing with early urbanisation. The demographic framework I want to look at is from this book here, Langton and Morris, 1986, Atlas of Industrialising Britain. That's the cover of the book. Nice design, anyway, I thought I'd show that to you. But here are some scans of illustrations in that book. Right, we're now going back to the middle of the 19th century, and we're looking at employment in agriculture now. So basically, the darker the picture, the darker the lines, the higher the rate of employment in agriculture. So on the left we have 1851, and on the right we have 1911, and you can see that, well, there's a lot of agriculture, a lot of people involved in agriculture in 1851, and far fewer in 1911, except for some of the more peripheral areas. So that's something that's clearly happening. This is, in a sense, the obverse of the previous pair of pictures. Okay, this is employment in manufacturing, and you can see that that in large swathes of the sort of the Midlands and the west, northwest of the country, you have high proportion of people, 50% and over of the population involved in manufacturing in 1851. And then by 1911 that had just started to increase to places like South Wales, the northeast of England, Glasgow, and a little bit around London as well, which is generally not a manufacturing area. Okay, so that's occupational types. Now, getting to some even more interesting things here. Population density, 1801 to 1911. So on the left, you can see that there is high density. I'm not sure what the scales are here, but again, some of the same areas, the West Midlands and West Yorkshire and Lancashire, okay, and London as well. A little bit in the northeast of England. And then by 1851, you get a much higher proportion, a much greater density, again in those same areas. And that continues then into the next century, as you can see in the third slide there. So I suppose a question for a dialectologist is, what's happening linguistically here with suddenly we get great increases in population density and decreases in some other places. Okay, does that have any consequences? So I'll touch on that here. Population growth. On the left, 1801 to 1851. Okay, this is total change. So the same areas, predictably enough, appear to have considerable population growth. And 1851 to 1901, the same areas again. This time London seems to figure more prominently as somewhere where population is growing. So again, these are not surprising things. But then we have to ask the question, where does this population change come from? Well, here are two charts here. On the left, we're now talking about 1851 to 1911, so basically the second half of the 19th century. Natural increase. So this would presumably be the difference between people dying and people being born, something like that. So natural increase. And then on the right, you see change due to migration. Okay. Now, one interesting thing here in both charts is that, especially the migration chart on the right, is that the speckled bit is actually the most negative, so to speak, the biggest decreases in population due to migration out of those areas to somewhere else, and that lighter areas are actually slightly less. That's slightly confusing the way that's being done. So you see vast areas of the whole of Great Britain losing population to somewhere else, and presumably that is mainly to the cities, including London. Okay, so we have natural increase and migration, and one of the questions is this going to have any, are we talking about new dialect formation possibly here? But let's have a look at northern cities. Is this population growth rapid enough to lead to the formation of a new dialect? And ancillary to that, how much of that is caused by migration? Okay, so here is a big table which I've compiled from various sources, looking at population growth. Let's just briefly look at the distinction between 1801 and 1831, a 30-year period, and just look at those cities there from the north, arrange them from north to south. So Glasgow seems to have increased enormously. Maybe the city boundaries were changed or something. It seems a massive increase. Newcastle, quite a major increase, but Leeds much more so. Hull was always, at that time, a small place, didn't become a big place until much later in the century. Manchester increased a lot in that period, more than doubled. The same is true of Liverpool and Sheffield. So the question is whether that increase is actually enough to form new dialects for the sort of situation to be sufficiently turbulent, if you like, for the formation of something happening like that. So, just a stopping off point now, summary, big demographic changes with high concentrations in the new industrial cities in the north of England, south of Scotland and in South Wales, actually a real picture across that period. They were caused by population increases, and they were the result of in-migration and natural increase. So, the question, I suppose, is, given this sort of high migration, was it in fact sufficient to cause this, to cause what Muthwaini calls swamping? So I mean, sociolinguists generally, we like round numbers, I suppose. We're not all that precise. So 50% is actually quite a nice round number. And various sociolinguists have said that in order for a population to be swamped linguistically, you need to have 50% of the population being not native to that particular place. Okay, that if you have that weight of population who are not native to the place, who have moved in from somewhere else, then that will have an effect on the way that way of speaking in that location changes in the ensuing generation or so. Okay, but then I simply said we just need more work on this. I don't know the answer to that. Okay, I don't know the absolute figures in Britain, and I don't think anybody can reliably say whether 50% is the right number. And of course, there are all sorts of other factors coming in here as well, not just the number itself, like which languages it is, what relationship or how much contact there is between the new population and the existing population, and so on. Anyway, but let's move forward now into the 20th century and onwards, and just ask the question, without possibly answering it immediately, what effect does demographic change since 1800 have on community and wider social structures, societal structures? And I've sort of thought, well, interpersonal social relations change as a result of people moving around, all right? As a result also of changes in social class arrangements, capitalism in the 19th century. So you have, those sorts of relationships, how people live, whether they live spread out, whether they live communally, and so on. And so this affects the way people talk to each other, and possibly then affecting language change. So just some keywords to throw out here: mobility, urbanisation, contact, socioeconomic class, gender, and finally ideology, all right, which is attitudes, really, okay? Things like attitudes and identity. Okay, so let's just have a look at some information now and see what information we actually have about dialects in the middle of the 19th century. And to go back to the first slide, can we project what is known about recent linguistic change onto a past era? What trends might we expect? Well, the kinds of things that happen now. Dialect levelling seems to be happening, but dialect divergence, dialect innovation, is also happening. Okay, so you might expect those things to happen. And then what sort of communities existed in the past, and what sort of communities, for that matter, exist in the 20th century and the 21st century. Okay, so just to see whether we have information now that can be projected backwards. I'm promising a lot here. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to fulfill your expectations. Let's try. What's our best evidence for late 19th century conservative dialect? Well, it's Alexander J. Ellis. The existing phonology of English dialects compared with that of West Saxon speech. And this has been interpreted and visualized for us by Warren Maguire at Edinburgh, who has written an article called Mapping the Existing Phonology of English Dialects in 2012, and it also has a website which is under development, is what he says it is. There are some nice pictures there, some maps. I'm going to show some of his maps, which are actually quite suggestive and quite useful for our purposes here, and there's the URL for it. This is the first spread of pages of the book here, 1889. Okay, this then is one of Maguire's maps. This is okay, whether you say or whether you say all right, and this feature is probably familiar to most people here. So people who say so singer, things like that, live in where the red dots are. You can just about see them there. And so we've got talking about the West Midlands and Cheshire, those sorts of areas, Liverpool. Okay. And one stray person here, and I can't remember, which county is this? Which county, is that Cambridgeshire? Someone up in, I don't know, is that Ely or something? I don't know where. For some reason, they said sing, and somebody wrote it down. Right, anyway, so there you go. So, that's some evidence. Here is a commentary. Some of you have probably seen this one as well. There can be no doubt that pure dialect speech is rapidly disappearing even in country districts owing to the spread of education and to modern facilities for intercommunication. The writing of this grammar was begun none too soon, for had it been delayed another 20 years, I believe it would by then be quite impossible to get together sufficient pure dialect material to enable anyone to give even a mere outline of the phonology of our dialects as they existed at the close of the 19th century. Okay? Probably most people in this room have seen that quote, but some other people might have expected 20th century. But there was anxiety among the dialectologists that the dialects were disappearing, and they had to get out there right now. And that was written in published in 1905. So there's some evidence for what's going on back then. Okay, so we have a static picture from Ellis, and a whole lot of other pictures I could have shown you, and I will show you actually some more. And then you have that commentary, somebody who is detecting something happening to the dialects of his country. The linguists, okay, Joan Beale has found, she's done some investigation, that glottalization, so T-glottaling, little letter, that sort of thing, is actually older than late 20th century sociolinguists tend to have assumed, all right? And so it seems to have been, well, certainly sometime in the second half of the 19th century. It seems to have started in Scotland and then spread to northern England. And it also seems to be the case that the appearance of the same feature in London, round about the same time, is an independent development. All right, so those are surprising facts. Facts in the sense that there are, the commentaries from the period suggest that that's how it was. Okay, and even today, if you go to Liverpool, which is somewhere in the middle of the country, Birmingham, which is somewhere in the middle of the country, glottling is a fairly recent phenomenon there. Okay. Right. Now, familiar territory for many people, finding a baseline of younger people's speech circa 1900, not 1800 as the previous first slides, but 100 years on, survey of English dialects, all right, which, as you know, involve interviewing, well, getting dialect material from words, essentially pronunciations, from people who are relatively elderly, around the turn of the middle of the last century up to about 1970 or so, I suppose. Non-mobile older rural males. And this gives us a baseline, a snapshot, if you like, of quite localized, non-urban speech from that period. So that's what it is, and because of its, it's fairly representative, taken across the whole country. So here you have the existing phonology of English dialects on the left. That's the only thing you can see, actually. And pronunciations of I am, I is, I are, and I be, those particular forms. All right. The colours are not all that brilliant. They're quite clear on here, but not very clear on here. But the shapes actually tell you something. So the big, where the circle, the filled circles are in the north, that is I is. That's I is. All right. And then in the southwest, you have the triangles. That's I be. And then the crosses. That's I am. And then there are three squares, red squares, and that's I are. All right, so this is the Midlands form. Right, so that is 1889 or earlier than that, because the data was from, I suppose, elderly people. So this is Peter Trudgill's map based on the Survey of English Dialects, and you see exactly the same thing. You have I am in the far north, and then you have I is in the north, slightly smaller area perhaps. Of I is, bit of I are in the Midlands, the East Midlands there, and then I be in the southwest. But that's exactly the same, all right? And the thing is that this shows enormous continuity in this one feature over a period of 70 years, all right? And you know, I'm surprised. I was surprised when I actually put these two charts together like this. Nowadays, I don't think you'll find anybody who says things like I is, I'm pretty sure. Not all that many years later. IB, possibly. IR, I'm not sure, all right? It's been somehow standardized, de-dialectalized. So there was this continuity going on. And then, what's happening then in the later 20th century, post-SED? Well, people have followed up Wright's despondent call from 1905. I don't think they actually sat reading Wright and thought, oh yes, must go out and do this. But there was a whole lot, there has been, still is, a lot of activity around getting information about dialects. Variationists studies then from 1970s on, I suppose, starting with Peter Trudgill and then Leslie Milroy a bit later. And then more recently still, in the second half of the 20th century and up to the present, we have Dave Britton, Carmen Lamas, Don Watt, me, Jenny, and Warren Maguire are, and these are the people employed in jobs. I could actually expand that list quite a lot. People who are, in employment, looking at local accents, looking at variation in local accents, with a focus on geography, and that's an important thing here. Okay. Dialect change and social change. This is more really from Dave Britton's work. There are two papers by him. So he talks about dialect loss, dialect attrition. Okay. And he says that this happens, well, I mean, it's not just him, other people say this happens in phonology, in morphosyntax, in lexis. But dialect contact is not necessarily implicated here. Okay, that just bear that little thing in mind there about dialect contact. Then there's what he calls dialect superlocalization or regional dialect levelling. This is the gradual sort of evening out of the land, if you like, in terms of the flattening of the land in terms of dialect diversity. And this does seem to be caused by dialect contact, so, people talking to other people and then some sort of accommodation happening. Dialect contact, Britton tells us, is caused by what he calls the superlocalization of British society. And here we have a familiar list again, okay? Urbanisation, counter-urbanisation, new towns, new suburbs, this sort of thing, all right? This is, I mean, he has a lot more to say about superlocalisation of a society, but these are the causes of it. And this is the thing that this kind of contact between people is what causes dialect contact and the changes that happen. Okay, this next slide, it says dialect change. I didn't want to say dialect levelling or something like that, because dialect levelling some sort of assumes a contact model, but that's just one model that I think applies here. So de-dialectalization, this is lexical, phonological, grammatical de-dialectalization on those various levels. I'll show you an example of that in a moment. Peter Au and Franciscans refer to this as vertical leveling. Right? This is the idea, and they emphasize by that phrase the importance of a standard language. Okay? And a standard language is not something that you necessarily talk to people who speak a standard language. You probably hear them in school and TV and so on, but it might change your view of the world. Okay? So this may or may not happen without contact. Obviously, people do talk to standard speakers as well, but it may or may not have anything to do with contact. And then you have our friend dialect leveling, dialect superlocalization. I won't say any more about that, but diffusion then is a sort of, not exactly a subcategory, but it's a phenomenon that happens and can be shown quite well. Geographical diffusion, contagion diffusion, which is a nice term, which basically means that you don't move, but you infect the next person that you meet, and they get a chain reaction across the country, just as with something like th or something. I'll show you a map of th for th in just a minute. Then there's migration diffusion. This is people moving and taking the disease on one hand, or the nice new linguistic features on the other with them. Innovation. Now, it may be endogenous to the speech community, and not, so you're thinking about sort of internal causes of change. I'm not just thinking of internal causes of change to do with structural factors in the phonology or the morphology, but endogenous to a speech community. And by saying that, I'm not saying anything about the nature of that speech community, whether it's very, very monolingual and highly focused in the sense that some linguists talk about a village dialect somewhere, or whether it's a community that itself is quite heterogeneous. But it's something that's come out of that community. That's what I mean by endogenous innovation, endogenous change. So it may be induced by dialect or language contact or not. Okay, so that's innovation. Here is an example of phonological de-dialectalization as promised. This is, in this case, a move to a standard English pronunciation of individual lexical items. This is from County Durham, and what I've got is a division into 4 word sets here. Traditional County Durham would be something like this, and apologise to anybody from that region when I read the following, okay? Food, choose, move, oot, mooth, hoose, toon, coo, doon, all right? Then you have out and nout, and then you have fower, douter, thout, and bout. Those are the traditional dialect pronunciations of those words. You have 2 classes. You have the oo class and the ow class. And as you can see, they don't align very well with what we think of as standard English, all right? Now, so we've got the choose vowel and we've got the mouth vowel. What then happens in the course of time, and I won't take you through this in detail, but in the fullness of time, by the time you get to the late 20th century, you then have most people actually saying something like this. Okay, so maybe with a front vowel: food, choose, move, prove. Then out, mouth, house, down, cow, down. Then out and out. Those 2 words are robust in the north of England. So you have a merger between the oot, the old oot, and the old out. They're both now out, all right? They have the same pronunciation. And instead of saying fower, they say far with a northern vowel, for, darter, thart, and bart. All right? So the sense in which those vowels, although they're not southern vowels or RP vowels, are aligned with standard English. All right? So the question is, why do people do this? Is it because they listen to their neighbours and think, yeah, okay, so this form of speech coming from somewhere else is cool, or something like that? Correct, neighbour? Well, cool, because of the interaction. If you go to other parts of the country, you don't get this alignment. You get a different alignment, probably. But standardisation is something that has actually happened. And maybe ideology, attitudes come into this, okay? So the alignment ends up being, perfectly aligned, in fact, with standard English. Not sort of almost aligned, but it's 100% aligned with standard English. Is this contact or is it something else? And I'll just leave that open for now. Right, we have two linguists here, Henning Andersen and Peter Trudgill. Henning Andersen's work in the 1980s he was interested in communities and diffusion and change, dialectology, and Peter Trudgill has been interested in the same things. So, they believe that speech communities vary according to their degree of external contact, okay, whether they have contact with other places or not. And communities are more or less isolated or peripheral, or they are more or less mainstream or high contact. So you have this idea of peripherality and contact as being somewhat similar things. And then, do these ideas have explanatory value for the development of British dialects in the last, century or so? Right. Now, I'm going to have some more detailed slides. So, high contact situations involving child-to-child contact are more likely to lead to complexification, Trudgill says. All right. So this is children learning language. And if it's contact between children of two different language groups or dialect groups, then it's possible for young children, to actually learn new features which are complex. And what often happens, according to Trudgill, in that situation, is that you get complexification, but not in general, but you get the addition of new morphological forms and new phonological forms, new phonological units as well. So it's actually what you call additive complexification. Anyway, complexification, children, that's the key words here. High contact situation involving adult-to-adult contact is more likely to lead to simplification of inventories and paradigms, because adults are not good at learning that kind of irregularity, that kind of complexity, all right? Especially not in situations where they're not being instructed. Okay, so that's what happens there. And low contact situations, he says, are likely to lead to the preservation of existing complexity. So he cites the example of Icelandic, which has a lot of morphological complexity in relation to the other Scandinavian languages, and that's a preservation of complexity in a relatively isolated community. But low contact situations are also, he says, more likely to lead to the spontaneous production of complexity, internally motivated, not through borrowing. So this spontaneous production of complexity, he cites the Faroe Islands, which is another collection of islands in the middle of the North Atlantic somewhere, where they have what Trudgill and some other linguists have called exorbitant sound changes. So, for instance, there's a Scandinavian name, okay, Johan, or you can pronounce it in different ways, John, and in Iceland it's Johan, I think, Johan in Norway, and similar things like that. But in the Faroes it's Yegvan, okay, so there you go. And instead of saying, if the word for island is that sort of thing, in Scandinavian they say Odj. The Faroese say Odj, right? And so these are examples of spontaneous changes which have happened not through contact, but because these have been close-knit communities over many centuries. Right, so let's move back to Britain and think about what's going on here. But so here we have these some ideas here which are just important. Okay, contact versus isolation, we've mentioned that. Social networks I haven't mentioned, dense versus loose social networks. And then social stability versus instability. This is something I'll be coming back to briefly. And then relatively small versus relatively large community size. And that turns out to be quite important for predicting what, who infects or who affects, or I should say, whom. This is what we'll be talking about. Back to Andersen, okay. He talks about, okay, and this is not new material here, open versus closed communities. And open versus closed also applies to the dialects. So external contact is either high or it's low or somewhere in between, all right? So this is open versus closed. Bear that in mind because something new is going to come up now, a new distinction which I haven't touched on, and that is what he calls exocentric versus endocentric communities. And this also applies to dialects. And here, attitudinal factors favour versus disfavour selecting external norms. Okay, So it's, you know, if I am endocentric, that means I don't want to, I'm impervious to anybody else, and I do my own thing. If I'm exocentric, then I allow things to come in and I accept them, all right? And that's a question of my attitude. So you can, you know, say a whole community is composed of people who are on the whole like that. It doesn't say that everybody is like that, of course, but on average the community is. So open-closed, that's contact. Exocentric, endocentric, that is attitude. And that allows us, and I think you can see what's coming next, to come up with the idea of endocentric closed communities, maybe geographically peripheral, self-contained, all right? Endocentric open, and these are typically apparently urban, innovative in the context of, and he says, great or fair amounts of interdialectal communication. Okay, so high contact as well. And because of their openness, it's claimed, not Andersen, but other people have claimed, because of their high external contact, the features may diffuse outwards because there is contact with other people. But they are nonetheless resistant to outside features. Okay, so that's endocentric open. Exocentric closed, linguistic norms are pervious to outside influence, but contact is slight. Right? They don't see anybody particularly, but they have a particular orientation towards the outside world and other norms. Exocentric open, these can often be rural communities, but they're not like some of the rural ones in type 1. They're not particularly protective of local norms. And they are strongly affected by incoming features diffusing from local urban centres. This is the idea of size coming in here. It's a traditional idea, of course. So this is the four-way classification. It's not, well, I've elaborated it, but it's really after Andersen and Grönlund. Okay, speech community typology and dialect change, Great Britain. Okay, I'm going to now mention two features I'm going to be talking about and ways of investigating them, and what they tell us about the kinds of communities in which these changes happen. Leslie Milroy came up with the idea a few years ago of off-the-shelf or under-the-counter features on the social dynamics of sound changes, an article that she wrote, came out a few years ago. So, there are global changes in Britain, also perhaps in the English language generally. Global changes are off-the-shelf and linguistically simple. So TH fronting seems to be something that people pick up at odd times. T-glottaling is something you can turn on or off. You can acquire it if you don't already have it. Goose fronting, to some extent, the same thing as well. There's evidence that people front their goose fowl as they grow older, if that is what the community is also doing. These are, well, Milroy said, cognitively simple. She said they're available in the community, and that direct contact is not essential, she says, for people to pick that up, pick these features up. But then, on the other hand, there are local changes which are often linguistically complex, and the Belfast short a is something that is a case in point, and this is something that Jim Milroy wrote about some years ago now. So we'll look at these two in turn, off-the-shelf and under-the-counter features. So first of all, this is the spread of TH fronting. And, okay, this is when you say thin for thin, for instance. And what I did some years ago was to establish the date of birth of people who were part of cohorts where it was not really bizarre to be TH fronting, but it was still a minority thing to be doing, TH fronting. It wasn't idiosyncratic, but maybe there was a background of TH fronting, maybe 20% or something like that. So in London, this seems to be 1850. In Bristol, it appears to be 1880, and then Reading in between, 1950. All right, so this is the Great Western Railway, I think, that was founded, and it took TH fronting from London to Bristol, but didn't get off at Reading, even though the train stopped at Reading, and they still do. Anyway, that apart, then if you look at the dates further up, you see that the dates get later and later. All right. And then just a few years ago, Kevin Watson, former colleague, found that TH fronting had appeared between his PhD data and in about 2000, and his next project for 5 years later, all of a sudden, people the same age, but a later cohort, were TH fronting. So he reckons that it came in between people born between 1985 and 1995. So when I did this chart many years ago now, I was actually right in saying that it was absent in Liverpool. I feel somehow vindicated by that. But, and Peter Trudgill has said similar things about Norwich. He says, yeah, 1960, and he has, actually shown that. Anyway, so what does this mean in terms of our centricity and openness and closeness or so on? So it suggests to me, at least, this particular feature, a series of exocentric communities, which may be open or closed in terms of contact, receiving features from a neighbouring town, all right? So this is geographical diffusion. And then endocentric open communities, which are sources of innovations, allowing those innovations to diffuse outwards. So this is, these are the obverse, if you like. So these are urban centres. So off-the-shelf features are the result of contact, but not necessarily involving young children. That's why it's this idea of off-the-shelf, if you like. Here's an under-the-counter feature here. Belfast, right. So what you'll then find is that that this vowel is ranges from front to back, rounded, depending more or less on the phonology, and also to some extent on the lexical item. So people in Belfast are things like beg and bang, back, flash, back, grass, and bod, and mon, things like that. Pardon my accent again. Now, if you are a person moving into Belfast, one of these inner city districts of Belfast, and you want to sound like one of the inner city people, it's pretty difficult to actually learn this, all right? You're not going to get it right. Instead, if you are a sort of middle-class person, or I should actually say, I forgot to say, endocentric closed here, all right? These are communities which have their own norms, they don't look anywhere else for their norms, and there's relatively little contact, and Leslie Milroy writes about that. She doesn't talk in terms, and yeah, I think she does talk about this. They are closed in the sense that, only rarely do they actually meet people from somewhere else, and there are certain groups of people who do go and work somewhere else. They're forced to, actually, through unemployment, closure of a shipyard, for instance. They're forced to move outside the community for work, and that has some effect on their accents. So endocentric closed. And then the outer city, okay, they just simply say bag, back, cap, map, passage, and so on. Exactly the same vowel all the way through, a simple system. And I suppose you could say this is an exocentric community. Okay, they probably have orientation somewhere else to some extent, and they're probably open as well in that they're relatively mobile, high contact. Okay, moving on. I don't ask Deviana the question, how much longer would you like me to speak for? Because I see it is 20:07. 10 minutes, would that be all right? 10 minutes? Yeah, it's fine, yeah, as long as you can keep with me. Right, in fact, not all that many more slides. Okay, Huntly is a small town in Aberdeenshire, not that far from Aberdeen, about 30 miles, 40 miles from Aberdeen, where Jonathan Marshall did his PhD study some years ago. Okay, now what's this a picture of, right? Well, Fovar is a variable, composite variable that he made up, adding various changes that seem to be happening in this particular small town by comparing old people and younger people, and coming up with a composite index, okay, and this is sort of change, in fact. And these are actually what we now would think of as off-the-shelf changes, some of these changes, so simple changes. He then had a social network measure, which was very similar to Leslie Milroy's measure, so things like whether you live next door to the people you work with, whether your grandma lives in the next street, that kind of thing, or not. And he came up with this chart here. So the little dots then are individual people, and on the left, their score on the phonological variable, the Fovar variable, and then their score on the social network index. And you can see there's no correlation there whatsoever. But then he then chose something else, which he called mental urbanisation, and this was to do with what they thought about things urban, right? Particularly Aberdeen and other urban places like that, whether they liked where they lived or not. Okay, so what? And it was significant, and there's the regression line approximately. So you call this thing mental urbanisation. Not sure I necessarily call it that, but so this is an example of a place where people's attitude, not their networks, seems to be predictive of how they speak in terms of, well, these are sort of modern Scots features that they were acquiring, replacing the dialectal features. Okay, modern urban Scots, Glasgow, Edinburgh kind of features that were on the way in. So here we have this attitudinal factor and not a network factor. All right. Whereas elsewhere we find something else happening. So quite clearly these people are exocentric. Okay, but variably so, of course. Variably so. Not everybody is exocentric in their attitudes, but a number of people are, and this does then seem to correlate with how, to the extent to which they take on these recent changes. So Huntley is a dialect at the periphery, and there are other studies of dialects at the periphery as well. It seems to be exocentric open, type 4, meaning that, okay, I've already mentioned exocentricity, but it's open in that there's a reasonable amount of contact, all right? It's not a place that nobody ever visits, and they visit other places, okay, in general. It's a generalization. And this orientation, though, rather than the social network, seems to be enough to bring on the adoption of these off-the-shelf features, as I mentioned, which go into his Fauvoir variable. Right. There's another small community in Lindisfarne, Holy Island, which Warren Maguire has recently been investigating. And what he found there is a small fishing community where elderly people are strongly dialectal, or in fact, only a few of the elderly people, but recordings of even older people are strongly dialectal, but the younger people are largely not. They speak a general sort of northeast dialect of some kind that's not broad particularly. And his argument is that, well, people just don't, they're quite happy to live in the village with the causeway that's cut off at high tide, and but they work somewhere else. They buy into the local place, but it's a tourist place now, so they have lots and lots of contact with outsiders through the tourism, and they all work somewhere else as well, of course. But they are not protective of their dialect, and you get something very similar to what Marshall found in Huntley. Anyway, I haven't got a slide on that, but that's the general idea. So these are not that exceptional, if you like. And I think there are probably two important community types. One is endocentric open. Okay, so these are urban centres, and I mentioned three northern ones here, because there's been research in them. And in those places, you get, okay, these are sources of innovation. There's a certain diffusion outwards, and that's true in all three places to some extent, although there is dialect levelling going on in each place as well. They're endocentric in that they don't take on, their attitudes are certainly, in terms of Liverpool and Manchester, a big rivalry, as you probably know, and the dialect boundary between them is actually quite sharp. Okay, in terms of Liverpool features spreading out, they don't spread out that far before they meet Manchester features. So there isn't a levelling between those two places, which I think is why you could probably say they are, on the whole, endocentric. But they're open, loads of contact. People live in Liverpool, work in Manchester, vice versa, right? The M62 is always busy. So that's one type. And the other type, then, is the Huntley type. All right, even though it's small numbers of people, but this is the opposite end of the scale, if you like. These are small, and they're being subsumed into somebody else's identity. Durham, when I did some research there, I asked people, a long time ago now, and I asked people about their, whether they were Geordies. They said, yeah, we're Geordies, yeah. In Durham, and that probably surprises some people. If you ask a Newcastle person, are you a Geordie, they say, yes. Durham, if you ask a Sunderland person, if you're Geordie, you'll get a smack in the face. If you ask a Middlesbrough person, the same thing. But Durham, yeah, maybe, yeah. Okay, it's a very small place. It's 20,000 people or something in the city itself, and it's 15 miles from Newcastle. But it's almost too small to have this sort of feeling that they are not part of this big conurbation slightly to the north. All right. Maybe that's a point for discussion a bit later. I've just thought of that. Okay, so Huntly's very small, and Holy Island is very small, tiny, 250 people or something. Maybe this is a transitional, unstable phase, and certainly Maguire thinks that in terms of Holy Island, all right, transitional phase into being subsumed into something else. But also, I think you can argue that this is true of mobile suburban areas, such as outer city Belfast, all right, that they are both exocentric and open, all right. Research needs to be done, of course, and these places are not otherwise comparable in any way, these sorts of places. So maybe type 2, these are optimal senders of new features, and type 4 are optimal receivers of new features. That's just a thought I throw out to you here. Right, and now moving to other types of place, multi-ethnic cities. Maybe this is an entirely new kind of community that we haven't thought of before. I mean, we know about them, but maybe it's typologically different from other kinds of community. London, Copenhagen, Stockholm, Berlin, Oslo, Paris, these are places that are being researched currently. Okay, happen to be Northern Europe, but exists elsewhere, presumably too. The rise of what we call multi-ethnolects, speech varieties of multiple origins, which override the founding population's speech by swamping. So this 50% number comes in here. Okay. What are the conditions for the emergence of a multi-ethnolect? Well, 50% of the population being second language speakers of the host language. Have to be several input languages. I'm not sure if it's 3 or more or 5 or more. I'm not sure. We find ethnolects widely used in Britain. Okay, there's a substantial body of research now on ethnolects in places like Bradford, Leicester, Glasgow, Blackburn, where you have a sort of bi-ethnic communities composed of Anglo communities and then a British Asian community as well. And we're talking about ethnolects in that case. Okay, but multi-ethnolects, you have people mixing together because of living arrangements and because of the sheer numbers here. Social contact among children and young people, right? So we're dealing with, maybe new complexity coming up here as well. And it's somehow similar to the rise of new dialects, koineisation, places like New Zealand in the 19th century, Milton Keynes in the 20th century, which are highly mixed dialects, where there's no dialect, particularly in the majority. There's no dialect over 50%, shall we say. And here we have, again, close, medium-term relationships or friendships or whatever, contact between very young people and upwards. Okay. So, final straight now. These are some projects that I've been involved with, Jenny's been involved in, a number of other people as well, Sue Fox who's here. And so just looking at these, the only ones I'm going to be talking about are the London projects that Jenny and I and Sue have done over the last few years. Okay, familiar map to you. Okay, this is Hackney, surprisingly enough. Havering, outer city. So what we were investigating, just to cut a very long story short, was the difference between Hackney as a multi-ethnic place and Havering as, at that time, 10 years ago now, rather more mono-ethnic at least than certainly compared to Hackney. So let's just have a look at one linguistic slide here. This is a diagram of the formant trajectories of some diphthongs. Don't worry, I'll pronounce the diphthongs in just a minute. So this is Nazma, who was of Moroccan parentage, born in Hackney. And she said things like, instead of saying face, as you might do in London, that she said face. And instead of saying go home, she said go home, things like that, with a different kind of vowel, all right? And that's quite visible in this chart for those of you who can read these things. So this then is characteristic of the London multi-ethnolect that we actually call multicultural London English, for the want of a better term. Okay, so these are new forms, all right. And in a taxi that we came, the three of us came in this afternoon, the driver was a British Asian who I would think was about 30 years old, born in Hackney, he said, and he had this kind of accent, basically. His native accent was this, okay. So there are various manifestations of it. London is, however, diverging. So let's return to the situation we're talking about now. London's inner city is only marginally taking part in the southeast regional dialect levelling, all right? So there's little fronting of the goat vowel, so sort of saying gate for, or a cup of cake, or for coke. They say a cup of coke, all right? But it does take part in the off-the-shelf T fronting and T glottling and goose fronting, just like anybody else, right? So that happens. Those features are there. The inner city is innovating, so you have what we've called diphthong shift reversal. So the vowels are just giving you our examples of that. And then something that's a bit harder to explain, that is the reinstatement of H in an otherwise H-dropping area. So they say home, not home. Okay, the H is uniform, almost uniformly there. So London is diverging. Okay, this is something new happening here. So, and then what we would say is that these innovatory features are endogenous to the inner city communities. Remember the very first slide. Highly multi-ethnic community, highly mixed community, but a relatively low contact in terms of contact outside the community. But those changes then appear in this melting pot of languages and accents. So there's a complex set of language contact factors happening here, and children are growing up in an environment, learning English, where L1 and local dialect speakers are actually in a minority in some parts of some boroughs of London. And the same goes, of course, for the Anglo children, whose parents are English speakers. So these metropolitan inner cities are often socially and economically marginalised, and this leads to their being, I would say, type 1. They are endocentric and closed, along with certain kinds of rural communities which I haven't mentioned today. Okay, so that's a particular characteristic of them. And then we get the final slide. We have endocentric closed. These are the same terminology as earlier on, but I've filled these in a bit. So we have metropolitan inner city, London. The innovations are endogenous, right? They are from the place itself. So we have London inner city, high contact, but we also have Belfast inner city, low contact, at least in the 1970s. And by contact here, I mean contact outside the community. The contact, no, hang on, I'm as confused as you are about this now. What I'm trying to say is that London inner city is high contact in the sense that there are people speaking many different languages there who come from many different places. They've migrated, and their offspring, all right? But there's low contact outside, hence the closed idea, okay? They don't participate in the general upward mobility of people in London. The Belfast inner city is low contact in that is, single ethnicity, and maybe they came from somewhere else a couple of 2 or 3 generations ago. But at least in the 1970s, there wasn't much mobility there, and there wasn't much contact outside either. And there were innovations taking place there too, as you saw from the Bath vowel. Endocentric open, these are urban centres with strong external contact, favouring outward diffusion. So examples would be Glasgow, Liverpool, Manchester. You can multiply that, Birmingham. All right, this is type 2 I mentioned earlier. And then a type I haven't really mentioned before, low contact communities, exocentric closed, with a positive orientation to outside linguistic norms. Okay, they don't have much contact, but they have positive orientation. Change by ideology, not contact, ideology, attitudes. There's something subjective there. And I haven't discussed an example that Jane Stewart-Smith has talked about. At a time of social upheaval in Glasgow, Glasgow inner city communities began to adopt southern off-the-shelf features, particularly TH fronting, appeared, right? And she explains that by saying, well, you know, these places don't have high contact, but there was this period when people actually moved from some of the housing estate to some new housing estates, and that caused disruption of social networks and so on. And that was a critical time when TH fronting slipped in. Okay. And then finally, exocentric open. These are often rural communities, and they're not especially protective of local norms. They are affected by incoming features, diffusing from local urban centres, losing their identity. And the example was Huntly and Holy Island. And then outer city, Belfast, perhaps, also in other suburban areas, typologically quite different sorts of places. Okay. So that's it. And I remain exocentrically open to comments.
You managed to mention almost all of our previous speakers. You just didn't get a gender angle in.
I didn't. I missed you out. I missed you out. I did say gender, yes.
Thank you. Jenny, if you want to say very interesting. So I think we have time for a few questions. I don't actually know how long we should go. A few minutes, couple of questions if anyone has something they'd like to.
Just I kind of, it's a bit picky, but like, if you go back to your slide 42, 41, those are the ones about the urban attitudes.
That one?
Yeah, that was the previous one. They're measuring quite different things, right? Because the social network index there is kind of in separate bins, whereas the next one, whatever it was called, the mental attitudes thing, is sort of
it looks like a continuous scale, yeah.
I mean, is it really true that, like, I mean, they look like this, I mean...
Well, okay, this...
So, I mean, are you able to compare things where one of them is essentially in discrete bins and the other one is a continuous kind of thing? Strikes me as not well, I don't know, I'm not a sociolinguist, right? But like, it strikes me as not massively kosher.
No. I mean, here you have 40 odd categories, right? It seems that he was... I need to reread his stuff to see what he did exactly. But there's clearly a scale here of discrete numbers, but there are 40 of them. The previous one is just simply a 8-point scale, similar to the one Leslie Milroy used. And she had, you know, for quite a number, some of her variables anyway, significant correlations. I mean, she used the same sort of multivariate analyses. But yeah, I mean, she's been criticised actually for the fact that some of her, very little of her data actually correlates with social networks anyway. I mean, she has been criticised for that.
The thing underlying my question is really, you know, to what extent is social networks really just a sort of side effect of something which is much more kind of internal to the individual. So that, like, really the predictive thing is the second slide you have along, and this, I mean, that was what was sort of behind my question. Okay.
I think I agree with that, and I think if I remember back to what Leslie Milroy wrote, that she has people in her sample who have similar social networks but speak very differently. And I think, am I right, Jenny, do you remember this? Two women anyway who had very similar background, but one wanted out and the other was extremely happy to be where she was, and they spoke differently. So that is much like the next slide on here, right?
Which should fit better with your typology.
It does, yeah. So, Jenny.
There's also recently people are doing some work on a gregariousness factor.
Oh yes, I've seen that paper, yes.
It's
Derek Dennis, yes, I've seen that paper, yeah.
Yeah, so how gregarious you are will affect the social networks that you make. So you can read that.
Yeah, I mean, this is very rudimentary as a measure of something real. I mean, it's a kind of attempt to look at the kinds of contact that you have within your community, within your social network, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you and then back.
Okay, right. This is a
Yeah.
Didn't Bill LeBeau back in the Martha's Vineyard survey find something of the same? That there was the more you identified with the island, the more likely you were to have the local variable?
I suppose you could think of, yes, exactly. Yeah. And he didn't ask questions about networks, as far as I know, at that time. And there you have it's peripheral in one sense, I suppose, Martha's Vineyard, in that these communities which are isolated except when the summer people come. So it could be similar, yeah.
So it seems to me that the way that this is being discussed is by looking at places as inherently being exocentric or endocentric and open and closed, rather than people themselves or even dialects per se. And so this is, I guess I'm wondering, in that case, would you be able to even locate a standard accent on one of these scales as endocentric or exocentric? So Southern Standard British English, for instance, would that be, because it's a non-localized variety, would it even be able to be fit into this somehow? And I guess that also touches on something I was wondering, which is how can you really have de-dialectalization and vertical leveling without contact? It doesn't seem as though you can necessarily avoid contacting the standard. And as you mentioned, you'll have a teacher, you'll have the local lawyer or whatever, and you'll come in contact with them. So, quote unquote, but you're not, I don't think, discussing that as contact per se. So I'm just wondering, it seems like people can't necessarily know what the standard is without coming into contact with it, and then the standard itself may not even fit very well into this sort of four-way typology that you've laid out. So I'm wondering how you
so placing the standard. There's a sense in which it's a high contact variety. In that's how it came about. Certain migrations took place from the north to the south, and it evolved in London. So it's a high contact variety, but of course it has a different status from that now. It's something much more abstract. It sort of sits there in people's minds. And for many people, not all people, but for many people, it's an additional dialect, I suppose. They would have their local variety of speech, and then they could also use standard English or features from it. What was the second point again? I had it in my mind just now.
I guess in wondering about the standard, I'm sort of wondering inherently how can you have de-dialectalization without
contact?
That seems to me to not necessarily be possible.
Yeah, okay. I sort of hedged that in the way you said by saying, well, there's a teacher and so on. The kind of contact wouldn't. Nowadays you have media, and we have had for 70, 80 years, I guess, widespread spoken media, that is. Before that, there was literacy. We get that kind of contact, but teachers wouldn't necessarily be particularly good speakers of standard English back in the 19th century. Some would, but some wouldn't. But there certainly wouldn't be contact with standard speakers. So, you have to try and figure out how much of this de-dialectalization of vowels in Durham is to do with contact with people who speak that way directly, or whether it's contact with, just knowledge of how to speak well. This sort of traditional sort of idea. So I agree there is contact there, but there's some kind of attitudinal thing there as well. But you need the knowledge to be able to achieve that kind of shift that you saw there.
Is there a way with circularity here, or do sociolinguists first of all do a social study to find out about how a particular place is endocentric, exocentric, open, and so on, and only then go to the linguistic data?
But it's possible to Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. people go, I mean, you can ask people the sorts of questions that Jonathan Marshall did, I suppose, and that Warren Maguire asked in his small place. And then you can look at the contact patterns of people in certain places. This is nothing to do, we're not looking at language now, and you can establish some of those properties of broad properties of communities, and then you can see how they speak. So the circularity is broken that way, I think.
And those questions are a set of questions which every sociolinguist would use regardless of the place.
No, they're not. But there is, there's information about that. That's a product or a byproduct of what's being done. So, I mean, what I'm saying here in this talk is that something of a program, actually, more than anything else. So.
We might have time for two quick questions, I think, so, yes. Okay, you talked about multi-ethnic cities. Just wondering, can we consider, for example, a city involving contact between two different dialects? Is it a multi-ethnic city, or it needs contact between two different languages? Because I'm doing research on the city of Medina. It is a city in Saudi Arabia, and the contact is between the Bedouin group and the urban group, and they speak two different dialects, not different languages. So can I consider them
multi-ethnic? Well, I think Arabic scholars do consider them to be two ethnicities, don't they? You do. Am I right? I mean, yeah. The impression I get from talking to Arabic dialectologists, sociolinguists, is that the Bedouin are a distinct ethnic group with their own traditions and so on, and they, even after they've settled in the city, they still identify as Bedouin, even if they don't do anything special that marks them out as Bedouin, except possibly their language sometimes is maintained. So you could say the same thing for different ethnic groups in this country as well. So, yeah. Yes.
In your diagram, you said, the grammatically when it depends on area. I, N, I, each I, R, the I, E. That is, now we don't use it for so who decided
to stop using it?
I am.
Who decided to stop saying things like I are and I is and things like that? That's quite a profound question, actually, because the reason I say that is that somebody clearly stopped saying I is and started saying I am, which is standard English, of course. So there's a sort of levelling towards standard English in this case. And whether that's because those people started meeting people who were standard English speakers and thought this is the way to speak, or whether they were told not to speak it, or whether they were aware that this was not correct English and they would hold them back or something like that. Some combination of all of those things, I think, is a reason.
Southern England and West South England, they use the IP, which means very slowly. We use P vocals, usually, for example, praise be to God. We don't use your IP. So
No, but be in that phrase is, of course, a subjunctive of some kind. Yeah. Thank you.
I think we don't have time for more discussion here, but we can certainly continue to discuss these questions. I think Jenny wants to say something.
Yeah, but we should thank you first.
Oh.
Coming around here because I think there's a microphone.
Just stand here, you're fine.
Okay, so this is completely unplanned, it'll be completely garbled, sorry about that. But as this is the last in the series that was my retirement present, it's not the last in the series, remember, I thought I just wanted to say thank you to my colleagues for giving me this wonderful retirement present, and also for being such great colleagues. It's a really nice department to work in, it's intellectually exciting, and it's also socially fun.
and they're also all very good cooks. So I think maybe that's one of the reasons why I haven't actually retired yet. So thank you very much. And I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for coming as well. Thank you to the lecturers. You've been great lecturers. And thanks to Paul and Jenny, who are the actual lecturers who are here tonight. But also it's very nice for me personally to see people here that I've known for such a long time. My very first teachers in linguistics I see are here, Jean Aitchison and John Wells. That's really nice to see you. And my first ever linguistics colleague is here, J.C. Smith, or maybe my first ever civilised linguistics colleague. And I'm not going to mention anybody else because I'm bound to leave somebody out, but it's nice to see past and present students as well. And thanks especially to Zoe and Anita for doing such great organisation of this lecture. So I do hope you'll carry on coming to future events in these series, and I hope you'll stay and have a drink afterwards. I think there's some stuff outside. Thanks very much, Paul.